The problem of the technicality of the Heideggerian language as a species of the problem of technical vocabulary is, and of um, special sciences in general, allowing that Heidegger doesn't present himself as doing special science, but as doing science simpliciter, or, um, as it were, just looking. So Heidegger says phenomenology is the only um, ology or scientific practice which doesn't have a special zone of research, but it involves what every zone of research must involve, which is looking. Physics has a special zone of research understood in the modern way. It's very different from the way physics has been understood historically by the half dozen or so schools of physics which have existed, the Epicurean, the Aristotelian being the most important, the Platonic, the Stoic, and the other forms of physics, where physics refers generally simply to the external world as opposed to the study of ethicos, or the character, and as opposed to the study of logic or language. Modern physics obviously had to be specially defined to deal with a specific region, whereas Heidegger claims to speak in a way that simply addresses things, and therefore for philosophy, which then when we get into it in its technical vocabulary, we become ill at ease because we don't know if we should still be talking about philosophy, or if we should be talking about thinking or questioning, or use some other word. But since philosophy is the word most generally used in the vernacular, then we tend to use the word philosophy. So here's the problem is we grow into a world, which means then with a particular vernacular that we grow into, increasingly it's perhaps the same for everyone, and then specialized vocabularies tend to hive off. So of course I could see that also in daily life, that if you're African American, maybe you have two vocabularies because you talk one way to some people and another way to others, or maybe to the general public you talk one way. But people have different vocabularies in different ways. But the chief issue would be, how is it that the vocabulary we have before going to school or before any classroom then becomes a technical specialized vocabulary of a specialized field, and then what's the problem of the community? Then we have this problem that goes back to Plato of the communication of the experts and the distrust of the experts in the public forum. So what's the deal with the tension between doing philosophy, which I'll put forward this way: if you read say one of Locke's essays, you can mostly, or let's say even Hobbes, like if you read most of Hobbes, it's pretty straightforward, and you could sort of paraphrase anything you read back pretty quickly. You might not understand there'll be multiple misconceptions anyway, but you could sort of feel like you understand it. Whereas if you read Heidegger, you don't understand anything for the first few years, and everything you think you understand, you don't understand. And then, so a proof of that is that Sheehan has just come out with a book after more than 50 years of study on, which is a paraphrase of Being in Time. So if people are studying something for decades and decades and then coming out with a paraphrase of it, it shows it's not straightforward. And the question isn't simply that we're dealing with the translation, but it's the interpretation. interpretation of a technical language which is dense. Why is the technical language dense? Because somebody has carried out original research. They've thought things through. They've come up to conclusions that nobody else has come to based on evidence that nobody else has considered, or maybe not in the same light. They've drawn together certain problems. They've drawn together different issues, which may be, and sometimes issues that everyone is aware of, but connected them in different ways, and thought them through in different ways. And so the problem gets to be, I think, it's as though, it seems to me it's as though there were, what I want to thematize is, there's not just the alleged 3 or 4 laws of thought which constitute the basics of metaphysics, starting with Aristotle, and in terms of these laws of thought, the last one being most fully explicated only with Leibniz. There's also this extra one, which is what is thinking as speech, as something that has to come into conflict with the vernacular language as it's currently controlling the cave. I think this constitutes sort of a fifth law of thought. Let me thematize how the regular laws of thought are arrived at. It's basically through discussion. So and what I want to say is, this itself isn't. It is and it isn't. It's that we're thematizing it makes it into a special technical question, but it's one which is directly part of everyday experience. So, for instance, law of non-contradiction is something people experience all the time, which is we're all self experts in, which is that somebody says something and then later on they say something else and it seems not to add up. Columbo episode that I was watching yesterday, a lady trying to get away with the murder deliberately told Columbo a lie, that she had gone home right after work and gone to sleep and turned off the lights, and she wanted him to probe in and then find out that that wasn't true. And then Columbo says, well, you say that you went in at 7 o'clock and turned on the lights, but your neighbors say something that contradicts that, which is that they didn't see your car come in, the lights were still on, and etc. And so anything that's inconsistent like that is a kind of contradiction, whether it comes from the same person contradicting themselves in a statement or is built up in some other way. So then you get a metaphysical, logical law of speech or thought, of logos or dianoia. But it seems to me the same thing is happening constantly in daily life with respect to people saying, yeah, you're making this argument, but I can't understand what you're saying. And so, for instance, and often it's in bad faith because they just want to not think about the argument because they want to be able to dismiss it easily. But sometimes it's in good faith. So, for instance, Timothy Maudlin makes this, had a discussion about somebody who was pressing the idea that the block universe view doesn't make sense, but he couldn't understand what the argument was. I think the argument the guy wanted to make was the same argument as Sheehan makes when he says that the block universe is as though we're looking through a glass at an object, and is it really like that? That there's a pure object like that? That the object of physics is a pure object as though looking through a glass at a model of the world, of the cosmos? Or is it that that whole subject-object way of looking at things is when we look at it phenomenologically is mistaken. But this question of whether the thing can be understood or not has something to do often with technical points, and whether the issues such as the question that I just said, that whether the subject-object division makes sense, um, and whether even challenging it is cogent, or there's any sense to challenging it. Maybe it's self-evident, but then we look in the dictionary and we find out in the 17th century after Descartes, the OED has an entry that says the word subject and object almost totally switched in meaning. So they didn't exactly just switch, where you could use as a synonym the old meaning of subject became object, but they, in a more abstruse and difficult way, they almost totally changed the meaning. So the old way of speaking was no longer true, but the new way wasn't just a simple mechanical change. But then you see that's proof that it's cogent to ask whether this subject-object issue makes sense, and then you can go into it. But in order to explain all this, and this isn't part of our daily vocabulary. In our daily vocabulary, we accept the corollary of the subject-object question, which is the fact-norm or fact-value distinction, which in daily speech we always say, oh, that's subjective, that's merely subjective. Or this is a fact. The facts don't care about your feelings, and we accept a vernacular vocabulary which is based on a deep based on the Cartesian teaching, which took over the English language, which then became vernacular, and then we're stuck in a cave where that is dominant, and then we have this gigantic ambiguity because the teaching itself doesn't really seem to make sense, and so people rebel against that, but they rebel against it in a shadowy, groping way, and then someone who tries to make a clear, consistent case to themselves, or to make the best case possible, which might not be clear at all, such as Heidegger, ends up by saying something which is alien to the vernacular vocabulary. And so we have this fundamental kind of fifth law of thought issue, which I'm putting as thinking as saying what it is logically is at odds with the vernacular logos or logic or common sense of daily life. So then you get a war between common sense and scientific or technically thought out discussions, which however are scientific not in the sense of, you can say, here's the atomic bomb, here's the proof that this science that it works, that it functions. But you have to, it's the kind of thinking that it's not like that. It's more like the accusation, oh, that's merely subjective. It's more like the content of that, and then you have to think about it and say, well, does it really make sense to say it's merely subjective? Is this case merely subjective, or does it really make sense to say, no, this is decided by the facts? But then you look at the facts and you say, but don't we have different facts depending on who we are, just the same way with the subject? So for example, Heidegger gives the example of people living in a village life have never seen a classroom with a professor standing behind a podium. And then he said, what's the podium to a person? What's the classroom? What are the desks? What is everything, all the equipment to it? To there's that film, I think, a French film a long time ago about some cavemen who appeared in modern times, and then there's some cars coming by and stuff. It's just the facts are not the same. They have some reference to the way we use the environment, and then all kinds of questions arise, right? So um, we end up challenging the vernacular anyway, but some people have done it in a more deliberate way, and then most people, just as most books of fiction are bad, but only a very few are good. Most philosophies are bad, but a few of them are good, and then we get a tension between those philosophies, such as that of Descartes was at one time, and the vernacular, or say the germ theory on a more empirical basis. But I think that tension um, uh, I want to try to thematize that more directly as a parallel with the basic metaphysical laws of thought. Um, and again, I know it's been thematized also by Plato under this question of the expert and the Socratic um, allegory, as it were, of the children and the confectioner. But yeah, it's just an attempt.